a dried lakebed that scientists say has been empty for 10,000 years, a basin that sits below sea level, ringed by mountains that look like they were poured rather than pushed up out of the earth, and a story passed down through the Ojibwe long before any government surveyor ever dragged a chain across this place, that something was buried here, not dead, buried. There is a difference, and the elders were always careful to make it. For most of the last century, Death Valley has been sold to us as the emptiest place in North America, the hottest, the lowest, the driest, a postcard of nothing. But if you go back through the oldest tellings, the ones collected before the tourist roads and the borax mines and the official geology, you find something that does not fit the postcard at all. You find people who spoke about this basin as if it were sleeping, as if it were waiting, and you find a claim so strange that respectable history simply refused to write it down. Today we are going to walk into that refusal. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. We are going to look at what the old stories actually said, why the men who mapped the American West were so eager to bury those stories, and why the economics of the 19th century made forgetting far more profitable than remembering. Because that is the part nobody wants to sit with. The erasure was not an accident. Somebody made money from it. Let me start where the stories start, which is with water. Nearly every indigenous account of this region agrees on one impossible thing. There was water here, not a trickle, not a seasonal wash, a vast inland sea that stretched across the basin and lapped against the foot of the mountains you can stand on today. Modern geology actually confirms the shoreline. They call it Lake Manly, and they will tell you it dried up at the end of the last ice age, thousands of years before any human could have watched it happen. That is the official timeline. It is clean, it is safe, and it puts the water far enough in the past that no living tradition could possibly remember it. But the tellings do not cooperate with that timeline. The old people spoke of the water as something their own line had known. Not a myth from the dawn of time, but a place their ancestors had lived beside, fished in, and mourned when it vanished. And they did not say it simply evaporated. They said it was taken, drained, pulled down into the earth through channels that were not natural, by people who were not from here. Now hold on to that word, channels. Because when you fly over Death Valley today, or when you look at the survey maps drawn in the 1800s, you see features that geologists have spent a very long time explaining away. Ridges that run too straight, basins that step down in even terraces, like a staircase built for something enormous, and beneath the salt flats, ground-penetrating studies have found voids, empty spaces, rooms, if you wanted to use a word that respectable science would never allow you to use. And it is not just the voids. Go and look at the way the mountains meet the basin floor. In a normal range, the transition is messy. Debris, rubble, the slow chaos of erosion piling up at the base. In parts of Death Valley, the transition is too neat. The rock face drops, and the flat begins, almost like an edge, almost like something was cut. Geologists have names for all of it, fault scarps and alluvial fans and pediments, and every name is probably accurate in the narrow sense. But naming a thing is not the same as explaining why it looks engineered, and the naming has a way of shutting down the second question before anyone gets to ask it. Then there are the temperatures underground. Survey teams working the salt pan have recorded pockets where the ground behaves in ways the surrounding geology does not predict. Places that hold heat, places that lose it too fast, places where the salt crust sounds hollow when you strike it. The tourist explanation is that Death Valley is geologically active, which is true and which conveniently covers almost anything you might find. Active is a word that means we do not have to be surprised by anything. And a word that lets you stop being surprised is exactly the word an extraction economy once installed over ground it intends to sell. The Ojibwe word that comes down to us, filtered through a century of translation and mistranslation, describes a place under the ground where the old builders went to sleep, not to die, to sleep. And the elders were very specific that the sleeping ones were still there, still alive, in whatever way a thing can be alive after 10,000 years of silence. I know how that sounds. Stay with me, because the economics is where this gets real. To understand why anyone would want to bury this story, you have to understand what the American West actually was in the 1800s. We are taught it was empty, virgin land, a frontier waiting for pioneers. That word, empty, is doing an enormous amount of work, and it was chosen very deliberately, because you cannot claim land that already belongs to someone. You cannot mine a mountain that is already spoken for. But if the land is empty, if the people on it are just savages with no real history and no real claim, then everything under it is free for the taking. So the first thing that had to disappear was the idea that this place had a past. A real past, with builders and cities, and a civilization that predated the arrival of the men with the survey chains. This is where the Tartaria question walks into the room, and I want to be careful here, because the moment you say that word, half the internet either rolls its eyes or gets far too excited. So let us be adults about it. The claim, stripped of the noise, is simple. There was once a global civilization, or a network of them, far more advanced than the textbooks admit. It built with stone, and it built with something else, something we do not have a good name for. And at some point in the not-so-distant past, that civilization was ended, buried, rewritten. A new story was installed on top of it, a story in which everything old was actually built by the very people who arrived to find it already standing. Death Valley, according to the tellings, was one of the places where the old builders went to ground, where they sealed themselves in when the ending came. And the Ojibwe, whose traditional lands sit far to the northeast around the Great Lakes, carried the memory west through trade and through the long networks of story that connected the tribes long before Europeans imagined the continent as separate nations. The knowledge travelled even when the people did not. There is an obvious objection here, and I want to meet it head-on, because if I do not, someone smarter than me will. Why would the Ojibwe, a Great Lakes people whose whole world was forests and fresh water a continent away, carry a story about a desert basin in California? It sounds like a stretch. It sounds like the kind of connection you draw after you have already decided what you want to be true. Except the objection only works if you believe the tribes lived sealed off from one another, each in its own little box, never trading, never travelling, never passing anything hand to hand across the continent. And that picture is a colonial invention. It was drawn on purpose, because a continent of isolated primitive bands is easy to dispossess, while a continent laced with trade routes and shared knowledge and long-distance networks is a civilization, and civilizations have rights. In reality, the trade networks ran for thousands of miles. Copper from the Great Lakes turns up in burial sites in the southeast. Shells from the Pacific coast turn up in the interior. Obsidian moved hundreds of miles from its source. Goods moved, and where goods move, stories move with them, because the people carrying the copper and the shells were also carrying the news of the world. So a story about a drained sea and a sleeping people in a far western basin is exactly the kind of thing that would travel. It would move along the same routes as the trade, getting retold and reshaped at every fire, until a version of it settled into the keeping of a people who had never seen the place but understood that they had been handed something worth remembering. That is not a weakness in the account. That is how human memory actually worked before anyone wrote it down, and it worked for a very long time. Here is what makes the economic angle so uncomfortable. The men who first surveyed Death Valley were not neutral scientists. They were the advance guard of an extraction economy. The government sent them, but the money that pulled them west came from mining interests, from railroad interests, from the men who understood that whoever mapped the land first would control what came out of it. Their job was not to discover the truth about this place. Their job was to produce a map that made the land legally and morally available for exploitation. And a land with a buried civilization under it is not available. A land where the original people have a coherent, detailed account of who built the terraces, drained the sea, and sleeps beneath the salt, that is a land with a prior claim. So the surveyors did what surveyors do. They recorded the geology and ignored the stories. They wrote down the mineral deposits and left the oral history blank. And when the indigenous accounts were too loud to ignore, they filed them under superstition, which is the 19th century word for inconvenient. Think about the borax operations for a second. The 20-mule teams. The whole romantic image of Death Valley industry, that borax made real fortunes. And every wagon that rolled out of the basin loaded with mineral wealth was rolling over ground that the old stories said was hollow, that the elders said held the sleeping builders. Nobody with a financial stake in those wagons had any interest in confirming that story. Confirming it would have raised questions. Questions raise costs. Costs kill margins. And it is worth being specific about who those wagons belonged to. The borax out of Death Valley did not stay in the desert. It fed a company that grew into a household name, that put its 20-mule teams on radio and later on television, that turned the romance of the Empty Valley into a brand you could buy on a grocery shelf. The Empty Valley was not just a survey convenience. It was a product. The emptiness itself was being sold, packaged as rugged frontier heritage, and a product does not get to have a buried civilization in the fine print. It ruins the story on the box. That is the mechanism people miss when they imagine suppression as a room full of men agreeing to lie. It almost never works that way. It works through incentives. The mining company did not need to convene a meeting and vote to erase the Ojibwe. It simply needed to keep funding the version of the West that sold and to have no budget line, ever, for the version that did not. The geologist who wanted a grant learned quickly which findings got funded and which got him quietly moved to a different project. The museum that wanted donations learned which exhibits pleased the donors. Nobody had to be corrupt. Everybody just had to be responsive to money, and money had already decided that the valley was empty before the first scientist ever arrived. So the story got buried a second time, first by the ending that the builders survived by going under, then by the economy that needed the surface to be empty so it could be sold. But the details survived, because oral tradition is far more stubborn than the men in suits ever understood, and when you gather those details, they line up with something that should not exist. The elders described the builders as tall, much taller than ordinary people. This is not unique to the Ojibwe. Tribes across the continent carried accounts of a race of giants who came before, who built the mounds and the walls and the strange geometric earthworks that early American settlers found scattered from Ohio to the Mississippi and could not explain. The official response to those earthworks, by the way, was to insist that the ancestors of living native people could not possibly have built them, and then, when that became politically inconvenient, to insist that of course they built them and there was nothing unusual about them at all. Both stories served the same purpose. Both kept anyone from asking who really did. There are newspaper records from the 1800s and early 1900s, real ones, printed in real papers, describing the excavation of oversized human remains from mounds and caves across the West. Skeletons that were measured, catalogued, sometimes shipped east to institutions, and then, in almost every case, lost. The bones went into the collection and never came out. You can call that a coincidence if you want. A lot of things went into those collections and never came out. But it is a strange kind of coincidence that always seems to erase the same specific claim. The Ojibwe account adds a piece that the newspaper stories usually leave out. The builders did not simply die and get buried. They chose to go under. There was an ending, a catastrophe, something the tellings describe as a great covering, a time when the sky changed and the water moved, and the surface of the world was buried under a layer of earth that came from nowhere. If you have spent any time in the Tartaria material, you have heard this before under a different name, the mud flood. The idea that across the world, buildings sit with their first floor, and sometimes their first 2 floors, below the current ground level, as if a wave of sediment rolled through and buried them to the windows. Skeptics point out that cities rise over time, that streets get repaved and ground accumulates, and they are not entirely wrong, but they are answering a small version of the question to avoid the large one, because the tellings are not describing a slow accumulation. They are describing an event, a covering that happened, that people survived, that split the world into a before and an after, and left the before buried. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now then come back, where the after could pretend it had never existed. The Tartaria material goes further than mud, and this is usually where people either lean in or walk out, so let me put it plainly. The claim is that the buried world built in a particular geometry, star-shaped forts that show up on every continent, identical in design, in places that supposedly never spoke to each other. Vast structures attributed to civilizations that, by the textbook timeline, lacked the tools, the manpower, or the reason to build them. Skeptics answer each example one at a time, and each answer is reasonable, and somehow the pattern never dissolves no matter how many individual pieces get explained. Death Valley does not have a star fort, but the terraces, the two straight ridges, the stepped basins, they belong to the same family of shapes that keep turning up wherever the old world is supposed to have left nothing. And the Ojibwe framing gives that geometry a purpose the Tartaria crowd often misses. These were not decorations. In the tellings, the shapes were function. The terraces moved the water. The chambers held the air. The whole basin was a machine, built to do something, and when the builders sealed themselves inside it, they were not hiding in a cave. They were climbing back into the engine they had made, and shutting it down to idle, and waiting for the conditions to come back around. And in Death Valley, the tellings say, the builders saw it coming. They read the sky. They understood what was about to bury the surface. And rather than be caught above ground, they went below, into the chambers they had already prepared, and they sealed themselves in to wait it out, except waiting it out took longer than anyone imagined, and so they slept. This is the point where I have to be honest with you about what we can and cannot prove, because I am not going to insult you by pretending the salt flats have been drilled open and a sleeping giant photographed. They have not. What we have is a convergence, and convergence is the thing that official history is worst at explaining. We have an indigenous tradition that describes a drained sea, underground chambers, and a race of sleeping builders. We have geology that confirms the sea, confirms the terraces, and has found voids under the salt it cannot fully account for. We have a documented pattern, across the entire continent, of oversized remains being found, measured, and then vanishing from the record. We have an extraction economy with a direct financial motive to keep the land legally empty. And we have a survey history that we know, for a fact, ignored and suppressed Indigenous accounts as a matter of policy. Any one of those, on its own, is a curiosity. You can wave any single one away, but the men who write the textbooks have to wave away all of them at once, and they have to do it while insisting that there is nothing here worth waving away in the first place. That is the tell. When a story is genuinely nothing, nobody works this hard to make sure you never hear it. Let me take you deeper into the economics, because this is the part I actually care about, and it is the part that turns a spooky campfire story into something with teeth. The 19th century was the great age of the reset. I do not mean that as a mystical term. I mean it very literally. Across the West, an old world was being erased and a new one installed on top of it, and the installation was financed. The Transcontinental Railroad, the mining syndicates, the land grants that handed millions of acres to a handful of companies. This was the largest transfer of wealth in the history of the continent, and it depended entirely on the fiction that the land had been empty and worthless until industrial capital arrived to give it value. Now think about what a confirmed ancient civilization would have done to that fiction. If it became accepted fact that a sophisticated people had built here first, had engineered the basin, had left structures under the ground, then the entire moral and legal architecture of the takeover would have cracked. The land would have had a history, and history creates obligations. Obligations create liabilities, and liabilities, to the men financing the railroads, were the only thing more frightening than losing money. They were the thing that could unwind the money after they had already spent it. So, the erasure was not superstition versus science. That is the costume it wears. Underneath, it was an accounting decision. It was cheaper to declare the old world a myth than to acknowledge it and face what acknowledgement would cost. And the elegant part, from their point of view, was that they did not even have to lie outright. They just had to fund the institutions that would decide what counted as evidence, and let those institutions rule the oral traditions inadmissible. Control the definition of proof, and you never have to falsify a single fact. You simply declare the inconvenient facts to be the wrong kind of fact. This is how the Ojibwe account of the sleeping builders ends up in the same category as ghost stories, while the surveyor's mineral report ends up in the category of science, even though the surveyor had a direct financial interest in his conclusions and the elders had none. The elder gained nothing by telling the story. He risked ridicule, and later he risked worse. The surveyor gained a career, a paycheck, and a place in the founding of an industry. And yet we are trained to trust the one with the motive and dismiss the one without it. That inversion did not happen by chance. It was built. It was paid for. There is a detail in the tellings that I have held back until now, because it is the one that made me take all of this seriously in the first place. The Ojibwe did not describe the sleeping builders as a threat. They did not warn people away from Death Valley the way you would warn them away from something dangerous. The warning was different. The warning was about what would happen when the builders woke. Because in the tellings, the sleep was never meant to be permanent. The covering would pass, the surface would settle. And in time, the conditions that drove the builders underground would reverse, and they would rise. The elders spoke of signs. Changes in the water, changes in the heat. A sense, hard to translate, that the basin was becoming again what it had been before, and that when the transformation was complete, the ones below would open the chambers they had sealed and walk back out into a world that had spent 10,000 years pretending they were a myth. And here is where the modern data does something it has no business doing. It rhymes with the warning. Death Valley is changing. The record heat is not just record for the valley. It has repeatedly set the highest reliably measured air temperatures anywhere on the surface of the planet. The basin is not sitting quietly. And in recent years, the impossible has kept happening down there. In 2023, a storm dropped close to a year's worth of rain in a single day, and the dry lake bed that geology swore had been empty for 10,000 years filled with water. A lake returned to the floor of Death Valley. Not a puddle, a lake, wide enough and deep enough to float a kayak on, sitting exactly where the old sea had been, exactly where the tellings said the water belonged. The scientists explained it, of course. Atmospheric rivers, climate variability. Every word of the explanation is probably true, but truth and meaning are not the same thing, and the explanation answers how the water came back without ever touching the older question of why the return of the water is the precise sign the elders said to watch for. And the timing is the part that should stop you cold. Not centuries early, not centuries late, but now, in our lifetime, in the same handful of years that the heat records fell and the ground studies found their voids. The mechanism is climate. The pattern is prophecy. And the fact that both can be correct at the same time is exactly what official history is structurally incapable of admitting. Let me sit with that lake for a second, because it deserves it. For 100 years, the entire tourist and scientific identity of Death Valley rested on the idea that the water was gone forever. Ancient history, an ice age relic that no living thing had witnessed. And then in a single day the water came back and floated boats on it. The story we were told about this place was wrong in the most literal, photographable way possible. The lake that could not exist existed. So when the same people who got the lake wrong tell you with total confidence that there is nothing under the salt, that the terraces are ordinary, that the oral traditions are just stories, you are allowed to notice their track record. Now, I am not going to stand here and tell you a giant is going to climb out of the salt flats next Tuesday. That is not the claim. And anyone selling you that certainty is selling you something. The claim is smaller and far more unsettling. The claim is that the people who lived here longest left us a detailed, coherent account of what this place is, and that account was suppressed, not because it was disproven, but because it was expensive. Because confirming it would have cost the men who built the modern West more than they were willing to pay. And that same account contains a set of predictions, and those predictions, quietly, without anyone rooting for them, keep coming true. The water came back. The heat is climbing past every record we have. The voids under the salt are real and unexplained. And the tradition that tied all of these together was ruled inadmissible by an institution that was funded, from its very birth, by the exact people who needed this land to have no history. You do not have to believe in sleeping giants to find that arrangement disturbing. You just have to follow the money, which is the one thing the official story has never wanted you to do. Follow it back through the mining syndicates and the railroad grants and the survey offices and you arrive at a simple, ugly principle that governed the entire settlement of the West. A history that costs money to acknowledge will be declared not to exist, and the more valuable the land, the louder the declaration. Death Valley was, and is, immensely valuable. Borax, then minerals, and now the strange new economy of lithium and rare earths that the whole world is scrambling for, the kind buried in exactly the sort of dry basin that Death Valley represents. The pressure to keep this ground legally and historically empty has not gone away. If anything, it has intensified, because the thing under the surface is worth more now than it has ever been. And an empty basin can be permitted, leased, and mined. A basin with a buried civilization and a living tradition of prior claim is a legal nightmare that no extraction company wants to inherit. So the story stays buried, not because it was tested and failed, because testing it was never in anyone's financial interest. And the elders who carried it, the Ojibwe who kept the memory of the drained sea and the sleeping builders alive across 1,000 miles and 10,000 years, were told, gently at first and then not so gently, that their history was a fairy tale, that the water had been gone since before their ancestors existed, that there was nothing under the salt. And then the water came back. I want to leave you with the piece of this that I cannot shake, the thing that stays with me long after the geology and the economics fade. The Ojibwe did not describe the builders as monsters. They described them as ancestors of a kind, as the ones who came before and made the world habitable, and then, when the world turned against them, chose to endure rather than to end. There is something almost unbearably human in that. A people who saw the catastrophe coming, who could not stop it, and who decided that survival, even survival as a myth, even survival buried under salt in a valley that would forget them, was better than surrender. Maybe that is why the story survived when so much else was erased, not because it is spooky, because it is true in the way that the most important things are true, whether or not the salt flats ever crack open to prove it. Somebody built here, somebody was erased. And somebody, against every incentive and every institution designed to make them forget, kept the memory alive long enough to hand it to us. What we do with it now is the only part of the story that has not been written yet. The men who buried it are long dead. The economy that needed it buried is not. And the basin, hotter every year, filling with water that was not supposed to return, sits exactly where it has always sat, below sea level, ringed by mountains that look poured rather than pushed, keeping whatever it keeps beneath a crust of salt that we have somehow, for 100 years, agreed not to look under. The Ojibwe looked. They looked longer and harder than anyone, and they told us what they saw. The only question left is whether we were ever meant to believe them, or whether the whole point, from the very first survey chain dragged across that basin, was to make absolutely certain that we never would. The water came back. Remember that the next time someone tells you the old stories are only stories. The water came back, right on schedule, into a lake that could not exist, in a place that was never nearly as empty, or as silent, or dead, as they always needed us to believe.